Welcome to the Sacred Window podcast. My name is Christine Devlinek. The Sacred Window refers to the tender, magical, and remarkable weeks following the birth of a baby. A birth giver is forever changed. Recognizing that this time is too often overlooked and misunderstood in our modern culture, we're setting out to be part of a voice for change and growth. We're growing awareness and broadening the reach of conscious postpartum care. Our podcast features friends and colleagues as interviewers. We're a loving community united by a common passion to change the paradigm of postpartum care to one that honors women, birth givers, babies, and families. We're glad you're here.
And I will never be the same again.
Hello, this is Christine Eck, and I am the director of the Center for Sacred Window Studies. And I'm so happy to be here today with Julia Jones, who is the founder of Newborn Mothers. Newborn Mothers is an online program for teaching postpartum doulas. Julia, I'm going to let you describe your program a little bit, but Julia is based in Western Australia, and it's such a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you so much for weathering the time difference and doing an interview.
My pleasure. Yeah, so I teach now all over the world. We have 600 students in 30 different countries, which is, Christine and I were just talking about the amazing opportunity we have these days with the internet to share this kind of wisdom. And yeah, we both met through studying with Isha Oakes, also online, which is another one of those little miracles. And now I've taken, I learned about Ayurveda and postpartum from Isha, and I built on that with a whole lot of stuff to do with brain science, anthropology, evolution, traditional cultures, traditional medicine from other cultures. And it was really what I was looking for so many years when I was just looking around at mums. I actually started this work before I had children myself, but I was looking around at other mums and going, this just isn't working. There's something really not right here. Like, what are we missing? And, when I started to study doula studies myself, I was finding they were really focusing on quite simple parenting techniques and breastfeeding, how to breastfeed, and maybe some sleep stuff. And I'm like, this isn't really answering that bigger social question of why are new mums so overwhelmed and exhausted? Why do we feel so guilty and ashamed? Why are we so disrespected and unsupported? What's really going on here? And also, what's happening? Because I knew from, particularly after I had my own babies, but I knew from my experience as well as my friends and my clients' experiences that having a baby changes you from the inside out. I knew that, but I couldn't find anyone talking about that. So anyway, I pulled all this stuff together, and that's what Newborn Mothers is all about. It's the concept that when a baby is born, so is a mother, and looking at how we can better support mums to be the mum that they want to be.
It's so beautiful to have this type of education available to enhance people who are already doulas or people who are in the caregiving profession as it is, to be able to add a deeper perspective onto their training and how they work with families, because there is clearly something that is so amiss and lacking in how this period of time is held by community as a whole. So yeah, what you're doing is amazing, and to have people all over the world have the opportunity to learn together, particularly to build connections with other caregivers doing this kind of thing, is truly miraculous, and I'm so happy to be a part of it with you and the greater scheme.
Yes.
Yeah, it's amazing. I would love to ask you a little bit to talk about and to open up a discussion about, you've talked about traditions, like cultural traditions from around the world. And I think we see a lot of synchronicity in the types of practices that those traditions offer for postpartum care. But a thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently is like, where did the shift happen where those traditions stopped happening? And I would love to open up a discussion with you about how we've lost some of those traditions in the first place.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because obviously I came through this not through my own culture, but through exploring another culture, which was Indian culture through Ayurveda. So, that was sort of my first little window into this world. But then when I started looking around more, I was like, oh, they do the same thing in China, and they do the same thing in Africa, and they do the same thing in Europe, and they do the same thing in Indigenous Australia. Oh, actually, they do this everywhere. They do the same thing everywhere. And that really blew my mind. I was like, where did we go wrong? Why aren't we doing this anymore? And I think this is where a lot of people don't realize that it's just a matter of how long ago we lost those traditions. So for me, being from European ancestry, it would have been back during the witch burnings, when the patriarchy rose and the witches were burned, and the women's knowledge, which was all oral, particularly because it was really an apprenticeship kind of system. You had to be initiated into these kinds of wisdom. A lot of the healing, herbal medicine kind of stuff would have been something you had to really earn the right to know. So it's, and in a way, oral knowledge has great power in that ways, but it also, when it does get destroyed, there's no record. It's hard to find that record. So I think Europeans lost it probably a little bit earlier than some other parts of the world. But then we colonized the rest of the world, and that's when we destroyed it for everyone else, So, here in Australia, until just a couple of hundred years ago, Aboriginal women would have been practicing all of these things. And I've interviewed some Noongar elders where I live. I live in, it's called Whadjuk Noongar country here in Fremantle. And a lot of what they've told me is very similar to what everyone else in the world does. And that they were a culture that was isolated from other humans for many tens of thousands of years, and yet still have this same knowledge. It's really blows my mind how human it is, how universal it is. Anyway, so as we colonized, as we globalized, as we industrialized, we not only lost our own culture as Europeans, but then we went and destroyed the other cultural traditions as well. And really, I think ultimately it just comes down to the combination, the patriarchy, colonization, globalization, industrialization. And specifically in terms of losing the village, I think that's happened very recently with the industrial age, because as we moved away from our families to have our babies, we didn't have our grandmothers, our aunts, we didn't have the kind of support, both the practical support as well as the knowledge, that oral tradition. We didn't have that lineage of women anymore to call upon. And so we had to find another way. And the way we found was control crying and formula feeding and routines. And, those things replaced what would have originally been hands on the woman, support for that woman to be able to do this incredible job that was never designed to be done by one woman alone.
Right. It is so fascinating to sort of backtrack and really look at the situations in history that have happened to create the results of what we see today in this huge, wide open, gaping space in caregiving. And I think really the only way to be able to change the pattern is to be able to process it. We think of digestion on a physical, emotional, spiritual, historical level too, and digest what happened, own what happened, and then start recognizing how some things can be different and how we can shift larger change again back to the way that it should be.
Yeah, I love that so much. And you know what it makes me think as well is so many, I just can't even tell you, so many individual women come to me, and even after I tell them these stories and even the facts, the statistics, they still say, but you know, I thought I was the only one. Like, is this really, like, I thought everyone else was coping, and I was ashamed because I didn't know what was wrong with me. You know, I think we have to stop this idea of being isolated and independent, and, you know, that's not, independence is not the goal. The goal is community and connection, and, you know, and that's part of processing. That is, we have to overcome that shame that we've been given, and to a point where we can reflect on this and look at the deeper causes, and I agree, tell those stories and make that change, not on an individual level, but on a cultural level.
Yeah, it is. And I think that it is bound to begin to shift, because everybody's saying the same thing. Everybody is recognizing the same obvious need.
Yeah, you know, in the 10 years that I've been doing this work, it's changed a lot. When I first started doing this work, there was no other training in my town. No one had heard of a postpartum doula. You know, it wasn't a thing. And then just in January this year, I published my my second book, which is called Newborn Mothers. And it was on it actually got to third on the Australian Amazon bestseller list, which was awesome. But it also was on the first on the pregnancy and childbirth. So there's a category on Amazon called pregnancy and childbirth. There's no mothering in that. There's no postpartum section. But I was really happy to see that on that first page of books, there were also, at the same time as mine, 4 other postpartum books that are all fairly new in the last couple of years. And all of them were on that pregnancy and childbirth bestseller list. So I was like, oh, it's coming. It's happening.
Yeah, people want to know. People want to know.
Yeah.
It's exciting.
Yeah.
Well, I think in the vein of sort of looking at how our culture has come to this place, how can we work with our cultures and our villages and our families and communities, our, you know, close-knit communities and our wider communities, for families to begin to set up support networks for themselves as they're entering this sacred postpartum window?
Well, I think the first thing is what we've kind of already touched on, but is overcoming that shame, and overcoming the idea that independence is the goal. It's really not, you know, and I even talk a little bit about how I feel some discomfort around the word self-care, because it still implies that you should be caring for yourself. And if you're not looking after yourself, that's your fault. You know, rather than leaning into community and asking for help and giving and receiving and connection. And that's ultimately what we're really missing. But unless we can kind of get that mind shift first, we won't even see the village that's in front of our eyes. Because a lot of women, once they do really, really make that shift, that paradigm shift from feeling like, you know, that they have to do everything alone, to realizing that actually it's so much more enjoyable and much more feminine, and exactly what our world needs right now for us to do things together. And then they actually start to go, oh, you know, there were people around me all along and I was saying no, I was rejecting them, you know, and I didn't realize, I thought I didn't have a village, you know. So, you know, I think really the first thing, and it's not a complete village. I mean, even once you've had that realization, there's still a lot of work to do, but you can't do any of the work until you've really looked into the stories that you've been raised with about why, you know, are you really meant to do this alone or not? You know, that's ultimately the question. If you can overcome that, then you can find your village.
Right. Or just because your mom did it with very little help, or your friends did it with very little help, does that mean that you therefore have to pull yourself up and make it happen?
Yeah, exactly. And it's difficult because, you know, the patriarchy isn't about hating men, and it's not even necessarily men, but it's too much of the masculine, and women can be upholding the patriarchy. So often if a woman is a victim of the patriarchy and isn't supported in her own postpartum, then she'll perhaps, sometimes that leads people to then want to support other women, but for some other women that leads them to want to go, well, I did it on my own and you should too. You know, so it can be really difficult when that is around you. But as well, I think what we really need to keep in mind is the long history of humans, not just the last few generations of weird humans. You know, like our culture's in a very strange place right now. Anthropologically, biologically, this is not what we were designed to do. It's not what we've done for hundreds of thousands of years. So, you know, if we can try and zoom out and see the bigger picture, we'll see that actually, you know, it's normal for a baby, and people are shocked when I say that, but it's normal for a baby to have around 8 and maybe even up to 15 different adult carers every single day on a daily basis. That's what's normal, and we are the strange ones.
Right. Yeah, I can't even imagine. And I felt fairly supported.
Yeah, I know. It makes you think. It really makes you think. Like, we obviously can't do that right here, right now. I mean, there'd be very few people listening to this who actually have the opportunity of 8, you know, trusted, close adults who could tend to their child on a daily basis. But what it does make you do is realize, well, no wonder I can't keep up. No wonder I'm feeling stretched in 30 different directions, you know.
Right. It's not meant to be like that.
Yeah.
It's such an interesting conversation. Thank you so much for your insights about this.
My pleasure.
You know, just the whole profession of caregiving. Obviously, now that, you know, our culture is the way it is, and families don't have 15 other, you know, community members that are close access to help support them when their babies arrive into the world, we have to hire doulas. We have to hire people to come in and give us the support that is not present naturally. So we have this whole profession of postpartum doulas, and among, you know, many other people in the caregiving profession, but specifically for this window of time we're talking about, we have the postpartum caregivers or doulas. And I would love to talk a little bit about like that profession itself. And I mean, obviously it's humongously important. We love it. We recognize that those caregivers have a place that is vital in our culture as it is right now, but it can often be a really difficult profession to have. And I wonder if you'd be willing to speak about it, the profession itself, and how we can.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's an interesting point that you make, that, you know, traditionally this care would have been provided by communities, by the family, and it's true. But I think there was always doulas. There always would have been midwives, witches, healers. There always would have been that woman in every village who was there for those big occasions in your life, you know. And, you know, in the interviews I've done with people all over the world, in England, they were responsible for the birth and the postpartum, but they were also responsible for laying out the dead. And then depending on their religion, that some of them did abortions as well, you know, and family planning. And then in Malaysia, a woman I was interviewing, she just said that it's a very well-paid job in Malaysia to be they call them confinement ladies. So even though in Malaysia they still currently have this this support from their families, they also have paid support. So I think it's actually one of the oldest professions on earth. You know, I think it's probably one of the original jobs that people would have been paid for, and even before the advent of money, they would have been paid in gifts and trades and food and that kind of thing. They would have been cared for. So, you know, and I'm not saying that the family can't do it, but in our culture, the family actually doesn't know what to do anymore, which isn't true everywhere. So in our culture, if you want that kind of care, you almost definitely have to pay for it, which is, you know, which is sad. That should be something that the community all rallies behind. And often I put it like this, that if, you know, like when you get married in our culture, it's quite normal for the parents of traditionally the bride, but these days probably either gender of parents will put money up for that wedding because it's considered a really important community occasion. And that's what really should happen around birth, is that, you know, like ultimately it would be like the social responsibility that that woman gets the care she needs. So it's a difficult thing, but I also want to just point out that it's okay to get paid, and probably quite normal and very ancient to get paid for that work. But here we are in the patriarchy, and in more recent human history, women have not been allowed to have bank accounts. Women have not been allowed to own property. Women haven't had pockets for their coins, to hold their belongings in. And that lack of women's rights means that women's work, all women's work, is massively devalued and underpaid. And that goes from being a doula to being a childcare worker. And even if you work in a man's profession, you'll still get paid less than a man. So it's actually a radical act against the patriarchy to pay women for women's work. That's one of the most kind of powerful things I think we can do to disrupt this system. So, if anyone moving into this profession is feeling guilty about asking for money for this kind of work, A, it's as old as the hills, and B, if we're going to break the patriarchy, then we need to get paid.
Right. I love that so much, really recognizing, because I think as caregivers, it can feel very uncomfortable to charge a living wage for our services. And this is a question that so many students have coming through our program, is around setting up their practice and what they should charge. And while that is not a blanket answer, in terms of this is the answer to that question, I think that talking about it as this radical action of social change on a broader level, that perhaps we all have a responsibility for charging what is right for the work that we're doing, to take care of us as the caregivers, and therefore start to shift patterns in society that run very deep.
I think so, yeah. And, some people are very fortunate that they've inherited money, or their husbands are rich, or for whatever reason they can afford to do it for free or for very cheap. And that's so lucky for them. I wish I was in that position. How great. But for most of us, for 99% of us, if we don't earn money from this work, we will not be able to do this work. We will have to go back to, some other office job, which isn't going to be so meaningful. It's not going to be our calling. And it's not going to be changing the way that society thinks about women and mothers and work and caring and kindness, So, yeah, if people are feeling like hesitant about how could I possibly charge for a job that I love so much, also, how could you possibly not charge for a job that is so valuable? Possibly the most valuable work we could ever do as humans is caring for mothers and babies at that critical transition in their lives. It sets them up for their entire lives, and it changes the way that communities work, and that people and relationships and connection and all of that kind of thing. It's so critical to me that I think it's like ridiculous that we could think that it shouldn't be charged, that it should be free.
Right. It's another one of those things that we just have to start wrapping our head around it in a different way, such as the difficult thing of asking for help when you need it and not feeling like you can do it yourself. It's another one. Like, I feel uncomfortable with this, but I have to work on this process so that I can look at it differently, and therefore start to move things in a better direction for everybody.
Yeah, and these are all the stories that the patriarchy uses to keep us oppressed, like the patriarchy doesn't oppress us anymore with, there's not most places like where you and I will be having an audience, in America, in Australia, in England, in Europe, that most of those places don't have laws that discriminate against women anymore. Like women can vote, women can have bank accounts, women can own property, women can vote. Did I say that one? Can get divorces, all of those kind of things. But the thing that's still upholding the patriarchy is the stories. It's the beliefs that they've sold us about how we should act, feel, look, be, and those are that's going to be the last thing that we get rid of. It's really hard. It's the hardest.
But perhaps the most meaningful. I find that the hardest things are the ones that are the most important.
The sacred window is an idea that we can all find ourselves in need of during times of our lives where we are tender, in need of extra care, and transforming our understanding of self. The concepts of care we give to new parents can be applied to ourselves in honor of ourselves to build resilience and grace in how we navigate this life.
So another thing that I really am excited to talk to you about and sort of help foster this discussion that's happening on a wider level around yoga, around Ayurveda, around basically any Westerners who work with other traditions that are not from a culture that is our own background, and the responsibilities that we have to honor and uphold those traditions and not exploit it or appropriate it in ways that are damaging. And I wanted to open up the discussion with you on how you sort of look at bringing Ayurveda and postpartum and the other cultures that you draw from, how you look at cultural appropriation.
Yeah, it's such a difficult topic, and I can only really talk obviously from my own personal experience, and everyone's going to have different views on such a big, complicated topic as this. But I think the biggest work that I've personally done to feel sort of comfortable in this space is actually exploring my own cultural background, my own ancestry, because I think when a lot of European women, ancestry women, come to this work, we often do think, oh, they do that in China, they do that in India. And that's why we start to think, oh, well, I have to do henna, or I have to do, this particular practice or that particular thing, that ritual, or, whatever. We start to kind of take things from other people's cultures. But what we don't realize is that we have these things in our own lineage as well. So if anyone watching this can find an elder, and it doesn't have to be someone related to you, but if you can find elders, because this is so recent, really, it's so recent. And I've interviewed, women who are living, who have memory of how things should be, because if you think about it, a woman now who's maybe a grandmother, if she can remember her own grandmother having a baby, or aunts or whatever from back then, you're actually reaching back quite a few generations, and you can actually learn a lot of stuff that's been lost, say, in the last 100 years. They might still know that stuff. So, I think the more that we can realize that these traditions are universal and they're, so inherently human, and if we can access our own rather than taking from others, I think then we can also allow space for all voices and all variations on these kinds of universal truths.
It's so true. And I think that's so beautiful to really witness how human. I know you've talked a couple times in this interview about how it's human understanding of what the needs are and what to do. It's just expressed slightly differently in different cultures. And I think recognizing that is so validating and empowering on just a universal level, in terms of recognizing that we're all connected in this situation. I do think that it's so humbling to really be able to start speaking from what is true for our own path, our own personal path, and the cultures that we come from, but also the experiences that we have in our own life, and really speaking to that and focusing on that, rather than being a mouthpiece for somebody else. Like, I'm not a representative for somebody from this culture. I'm speaking and I'm acknowledging that this is my path and this is what I know, and here is what I think about that. And I think we can all really speak in the most powerful, clear way when we really are speaking from our own path rather than from another's. And that doesn't mean that another culture isn't going to come in and resonate and really help us thinking further about how we understand the world. I think all of the teachings of Ayurveda, which most specifically is a background of mine in terms of education. So all that Ayurvedic education is sort of melded with my own perspectives and my own experience personally. So yeah, it is a very difficult topic, but I think one that the more we talk about it, the more clarity and understanding we have about it.
Yeah, I think it is. It's really tricky. And the other thing you mentioned there, which I think is really important, is acknowledgement, is really acknowledging where did we learn this from, and who does this really belong to? You know, and I think that's really critical. I think when it gets really damaging is when things are taken out of context and, you know, people don't really know who and where and what the meaning is. One really strong example that is very frustrating is the term mother blessing rather than blessing way. So, you know, and we've known for a long time now that blessing way is an inappropriate term, and yet people still use it a lot. And I find that must be, you know, for the people who that culture is disrespecting, that must be so hurtful when that happens again and again and again. And they've specifically said, please don't use the term blessing way, and everyone's still using the term blessing way. I mean, that's just so difficult. So I think if someone ever, you know, does say to you that's not cool, then I think we really need to listen and be okay with having those brave conversations.
Absolutely. I think it's an ability to be always learning and always taking that voice and being ready to hear it and learning from it.
Yeah.
So Julia, you have a really specific area of focus in your program that is unlike any that I've ever encountered, and I'm very excited to talk to you about your neuroscience background and your understanding and exploration of the brain and how the brain is affected and changes for birthers as they bring babies into the world, and also for partners and families, and how our fast-paced culture can really affect the brain and what that does to a newborn mother. I'd love for you to speak about that.
Yeah, so first of all, I will say I'm not a scientist at all. Just someone who's very, very passionate. I have studied at the Neuroscience Academy. I've read about 1 million books, and I've interviewed loads of scientists, and, you know, tried to really do my best without a science brain to understand this kind of stuff. But it is very new, and it's still, you know, it's still like there's still so many gaps in what we know. But what we do know is that there's an algorithm that can tell with 100% accuracy, just from looking at a brain scan, whether this is the brain of a pregnant, someone who's experienced a pregnancy, or someone who's never been pregnant. So that's it. All it takes is you experiencing a pregnancy, even if you don't even have a live birth, or you maybe give the baby to someone else. If you don't raise that baby, your brain has already changed enough that 100% of the time a computer can tell that. So that just gives you some idea that, you know, like, and this is kind of the next wave of feminism, I think, is actually embracing that we are in these small ways different. Obviously, men and women are more, we have more in common than what sets us apart. But what does set us apart is really this ability to create new life. You know, this is a totally unique feminine thing, and our brains do change drastically in ways that men and even women who don't have babies will never experience. You know, so I think that's really, like, blew my mind when I learned about that. And, you know, I could talk about that for hours, but the basis of the changes, the two main changes, one of them I call loving and the other one I call learning. And loving is really to do with oxytocin, which most people are familiar with oxytocin in the role of birth. But then it stops there, you know, most of knowledge, our knowledge of biology and women and feminism, it's kind of like, yeah, then you have a baby and you go back to normal. But no, that's not true. Your oxytocin levels are high for months and possibly even years afterwards, especially if you breastfeed for an extended amount of time. So much so to the point where it actually will rewire your brain forever. You actually grow oxytocin receptors in your breasts, in your uterus. You get new oxytocin receptors in your brain. You know, these things that just literally didn't exist before. So those are all the loving changes. That's what helps us bond, become more empathetic, better at reading non-verbal cues. There's so many things that are related to those massive oxytocin changes. And then on the other side, we also have something called increased plasticity, neuroplasticity. And way back in the old days, scientists used to think that our brains were static. You were born with the brain and that was it for life. And we now know, obviously, that that's not true. But the reason we know that's not true is from studying pregnancy. So when you are pregnant, then your brain plasticity increases massively. There's a couple of other times in life when your brain plasticity increases a lot, which are more well known about, funnily enough. So obviously babies have high brain plasticity and teenagers have high brain plasticity. But most people don't know that a new mother has high brain plasticity as well. And it makes sense that that's because we're learning so much new stuff. We are learning, and we're preparing for our role, for the stage in our life where information might not be useful anymore, and we're having to kind of rewrite what is relevant, what's important, what's valuable for our new job. So the combination of those two things is quite mind-blowing, and no wonder women feel a bit overwhelmed when they're having a baby, and no wonder our personality changes so much that we kind of go, I don't even know who I am anymore.
Right. It's so true. Really, it's like one of the biggest transitions ever in your life. So it makes complete 100% sense that our brains are going through taking on whole new characteristics.
Yeah. And, if we could just be a little bit easier on ourselves, just a bit kinder to ourselves as we're going through these massive changes. I often will liken it to upgrading the operating system of your computer. So, when you upgrade your operating system, it's really annoying because at first you can't, the keyboard controls might have changed and you can't find where things are in the menu anymore and the buttons look different. And, the first few days after the change, you're like, everything's taking longer. I can't figure out how to do it anymore. I wish I could just go back to the old way. But then after a while, you get used to it and you realize that actually the new way is better for the job that you're doing now, because when you're a mother, you need different skills. But because we live in this world that just doesn't value these feminine skills, mothers will get stuck trying to go back to the old way. They're trying constantly to go back to the old normal, rather than embracing a new kind of more feminine, mothering, nurturing, that's why we cry at the news, and that's why we feel like, all the world's children are our children, and it gets like written off as being like, oh, emotional women. It's like, no, actually, that is our true power. That is ultimately what it means to be, a mother. That's the whole point.
Right. It's really beautiful. And I think by having an explanation for why we feel different, it helps people integrate and be more gentle and forgiving with themselves, rather than, what the heck is wrong with me? I'm so different. I'm scared because I don't understand this new experience. When you understand the explanation why, it's easier to integrate, and then it's easier to forgive yourself. Just be like,
I think so.
This is happening, and this is great, and this is how it's supposed to be. I'm just fine.
Yeah, that's right. And if you have those days where things are a bit fuzzy, or you're a bit forgetful, or you're a bit overwhelmed, or a bit scattered, or whatever, you can just go, that's all right. I'm just upgrading my operating system right now.
That's perfect. I love it. Well, Julia, I am so grateful to you for spending this time with me. And do you have anything else that you wanted to share, talk about before we close?
Not really. Just if anyone is interested in reading my books or studying my courses, you can go to newbornmothers.com. And yeah, that's really it. I really love this work. Obviously, I'm incredibly passionate and obsessed with all things postpartum. So thank you for having me on and letting me talk about my special interests.
Sure. And I really feel feel like we could talk all day about it, but so I'm sure there'll be more. And thank you.
Yes.
And so again, this has been Julia Jones of Newborn Mothers, and I'm Christine Eck of the Center for Sacred Window Studies. And thank you so much for listening.
How can you bring something sacred to your current window of time? What do you have to offer to someone within their sacred window? We honor you for all you give and for who you are. Thank you for listening. The Sacred Window podcast is brought to you by the Center for Sacred Window Studies. You can visit us to find out more about our online training and mentoring programs, plus resources and products for and about the sacred postpartum window at www.sacredwindowstudies.com. Editing of our podcast recordings is done by Sienna Butler, and our music is written and performed by Sarah Emmett. You can hear more of Sarah's music by visiting www.sarahemmett.bandcamp.com.